Why do we get this label of not caring about our homes when we're renting? Like, in fact, we had to actually go through a huge scrutiny process, like our finances scrutinized. We had multiple interviews, actually, to get this place.
I think that we have this attachment to the idea that home is a physical thing. And in order to have a home, I need to buy this physical structure. And when I have that purchase made, then I can make a home in this physical space. But I think that one of the things that I've learned over the years is that the home is something that you make. It's not necessarily attached to a physical space. And like a home is something you create with people.
Welcome to the Modern Sense podcast, your financial-friendly podcast navigating the ever-evolving world of personal finance. Join me, Andrea Thompson, for insightful interviews and non-traditional perspectives on modern finance. Let's redefine the way we think about money together. Ever since I started my podcast, I've actually always wanted to interview you too. You have such a unique perspective that I think is really important to share with the world. And we talked about this before, but this might be part one of a multi-part podcast because there is so much to talk about with you today. But I'm going to give our listeners a little bit of a background on you first and why we're having this conversation today. So first of all, Vicki and Tom are clients of Modern Sense. They came to me about 2 years ago now, Vicki, approximately. Yeah. And we started working together and a lot has changed since we started working together. And we'll talk about that as we go through the podcast. But in general, Vicki and Tom came together as a couple later in life, and they live a cross-border life. And they navigate Tom's employment in California and Vicki's in Canada. They are lifelong renters, child-free, and have been exploring different ways of living life outside of societal norms. In fact, Vicki has taken a chosen break from employment in the past year to accomplish some major travel goals, and Tom will soon be exploring potential early retirement from his job as a professor. So welcome again. I'm really excited to talk to you today. And even in that intro, there is so much that we can discuss and uncover, and we don't have time to talk about all of those elements of your financial picture today. And we want to start today by talking about your decision to be renters. I think this is a really important conversation that is not often explored enough in, let's say, conventional Canadian financial media. And both of you have a really unique lens and perspective on being renters. So I would love to start with just individually knowing about your rental journey as individuals before coming together, as a couple. So how did that start for both of you? Maybe we'll start with Tom.
Oh, my experience as a renter. I think I've had experience with both. I've owned a home in the past, and I've also been a renter for years and years. And I think that for me, the decision to rent was around, I think, two particular items. The first was that I was reasonably sure that I wasn't going to be in one particular city for a long period of time. And the other was that I wanted to spend more time sharing space with people. And this sort of led to making choices to rent properties where multiple people could decide to live together. And I think that's probably why. And then it became really something that I enjoyed doing quite a lot. So it was a combination of like, I don't really want to be tied down to the city. And there's no doubt that I'm going to be living elsewhere in the future. And also I really like this experience of kind of, I don't know if I would call it communal living necessarily, but living among friends and people sharing space.
I love that so much. And I actually didn't know that about you, Tom. And so I want to come back to that because I think that's a really, really cool aspect of your story. Vicki, maybe I'll also get your perspective on how you came to be a renter.
Yeah. For me, I think everyone really has to start in renting. And so, when I graduated from university, I started renting. And speaking of communal living, I started renting in the UK. That's where I lived for a while doing my grad school. And everybody had to house share because housing is far more expensive there. They don't actually have a lot of things like single apartments or one bedrooms or anything like that. And actually they end up kind of getting into home ownership just so they can get away from other people. Otherwise you have to share these old homes. But I was like, I gotta live my own. It's been, 15 years of sharing space. So I moved to Vancouver and rented a 1-bedroom. But yeah, for me, it sort of became a financial thing. I was like, well, obviously I don't have any money. I'm just starting working. And, and then like Tom, it's, I wanted to live in different places. I mean, I didn't always know at the time, but being able to up and move, being a renter ended up being a big advantage. It's very, very easy to do. And I went down to the States and I lived in San Francisco. And again, I'm a single person. I'm not going to buy a property in the place that, I've just moved and I'm not even a sort of permanent resident or anything like that. So for a long time, it's just kind of a lifestyle. Like it's your only option. There is no choice. It's really when we moved back to Canada. So we don't live a cross-border lifestyle intentionally. Unfortunately, we're a little bit stuck. Tom's job is stuck on the other side right now. But now would be the time where we can buy. And I think that's the time now we've had the most almost like conversations about it, but kind of scrutiny, because now it's like here we don't necessarily want flexibility. Well, we do, but people don't think we do. And then, we've earned enough money. So it's like, okay, well, you're going to be here and you can afford it. So what's stopping you? And so I think that's kind of always been a very interesting conversation with other people to say like, surely you must be owning. It's the default once you have enough money. And now that they realize, yeah, you do have enough money, why aren't you buying? It becomes a very interesting conversation.
Yeah. And it's been an interesting conversation between the two of us. When we first met, I was like, oh, I want to buy, but I want to find a place and a place on my salary where I could afford to purchase. And I was kind of moving away from this idea of like living in shared spaces with people, creating community, and moving towards the idea of like having a home someplace. And my view has changed over the years for sure, because again, as Vicki just said, like we are at this place where we're like, well, I mean, we could afford it. And so why are we choosing not to purchase that home?
That's really interesting. I want to just touch base on a couple things. First, did you meet in San Francisco and you were both renting at the time?
Yep.
Is that how that originated?
Yeah. And Tom was in a shared house and I was living on my own.
Okay. And Tom, were you at that time a homeowner and renting out that shared house, or was it a shared rental community?
It was a shared rental. I sold my home many years ago. I purchased a home when I was doing my doctoral program and I sold it after the program was over.
And I'm interested in that because you started out then as a bit of a homeowner, and made a decision to change. So I'm curious, what was your experience like as a homeowner?
Well, it was both really great and it was also really stressful. And I think that once again, the reason I decided to purchase a home at that time was because I feel like I could afford it, but also because I wanted to have some sort of, I don't know what you say, like I wanted to have a little bit more say over how to build intentional communities. So I wanted like a house. I wanted to see what it would be like to kind of be the person who's kind of choosing and have people live in my space. So yeah, I was in a position where I found something that was affordable and the location was great and it would draw other people to that space because it was at this sort of intersection where lots of people would be traveling through on their way to school.
Okay. And so that's the initial community that you created. So you were a homeowner and then people would come through your space. And did they come through and stay there, or what was the dynamic of that community?
So that was not my first experience living with people. I lived with people plenty before that, but I wanted to kind of have a space that was my home that could turn into sort of an intentional life space for groups of people and friends, extended friends sometimes. But this is something I want to touch on really quickly. It turned out to be kind of stressful because you own it. And then you have all of these responsibilities. And I'm not just talking about the roof that needed to be replaced or the hot water heater that was super expensive that blew up like 6 months after I purchased a property. Or like, wait a minute, you have to do landscaping. I don't want to do that. Yeah. So it was also that when you have people and you open your house up and you turn it into a community, then all of a sudden everything gets used a lot. And even like under the best of circumstances, that means like a lot of upkeep. And
so it goes beyond then just the general, I'm going to be a homeowner, I need to put money into maintenance. But because you had a community that, again, trotting through your floors, using your washroom, etc., it created maybe a financial burden that you were not prepared for. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think so. Very much so. And the kind of stress that goes along with that. And it got to the point where it was so successful that I would come home from trips sometimes and my house would be full of people. And I'd arrive there. I'm like, wait, what's going on? And everyone's just sitting there making food. There's like, a dozen people around. It's like, I love that. It was wonderful, but it was also like, how did you all end up in my space in my house when I wasn't here?
And so what was the tipping point for you? Was meeting Vicki part of that decision to, move from a communal living type of ownership space to renting and being more on your own?
Well, I mean, when I met Tom, the question's for him, but I want to talk about the piece of paper. The piece of paper. Yeah,
sure.
Mapped out. And this was like a financial / lifestyle thing where he was trying to figure out, okay, I want to own a home. This is important to me. I have a professor's salary, so it's not going to be easy to do in many cities. And he sort of had all the cities in the U.S. kind of mapped out with like potentially where he could afford to buy. That's true. And then also, could he keep his job in California? I had to be close to an airport. And I don't know. Tom also developed this hybrid teaching model where he was doing a lot of online teaching. And this turned out to be extremely valuable come COVID, that he can now teach remotely, which is great. But I think partly it was developed so you could live in a different location, a place where you could afford and own a home and then, create a life. So it was a very intentional aspect to it. So I looked at this paper. It was so much detail about like all the costs of living in various places. And to be fair, like you kept having to scratch things off. Like as the years went by, you're like, oh, that's not affordable. Can't go live there. And a lot of them were also mountain towns. So the outdoor lifestyle was really important. So those tend to be very expensive.
Yeah, it was
good that you did your research, Tom.
What's that?
I said, very good that you did your research, though.
Yeah, it was a very elaborate multi-page spreadsheet.
So when you met Vicki, tell me a little bit about the origin story of your living situations when you met and when you decided to join your mutual lives together. How did that work out for you from a home ownership perspective or from a renter's perspective?
Well, so we met online, as we all do. And Tom was living in the Oakland, which is across the bay, and I was living in San Francisco. So I don't know if any of your listeners are familiar with the bay in San Francisco. It was literally like no weekday visits because trying to get from one to the other is too much. So we would hang out on weekends and, we liked each other's places. I was kind of surprised. I always think about because I did a lot of share homes, like all through my university. I went to boarding school, was very, very familiar with living with other people, and I was familiar with all the downsides. Mm-hmm. So I kind of assumed that Tom would be like, oh, we'll come and stay at yours. But he actually really loved staying at his place. Again, it was an intentional choice. He didn't just live with random people. He chose to live with a close friend. And they had a kind of really nice home life. And she had a pretty communal house that had lots of people over as well. So rather than escaping it. He actually, wanted to be there. And so I did as well. So we did kind of share back and forth. And then like so many couples that decide to live together, it's never, the timing is not intentional. I actually did lose my place, which is of course the big renters. The big mark against renting, or one of them is like, hey, you could get kicked out at any time. And I always say like, yeah, you could, but to me, it's not the worst thing in the world. I mean, if you love your place, and yeah, I know that's not the same for everybody, but when I lost my place, I got a big payout. So there's some upsides to it that people don't always talk about. So
that's interesting. You got it. So you got a big payout from being evicted.
Yeah,
which I think is maybe not as common in Canada as it potentially would be in the United States. I think the Landlord-Tenant Law Act is probably quite different, I would assume, where you were living at that time.
Yeah, possibly. I think cash for keys is probably a little bit more available to people than I'm not as familiar. And if we left this place, I doubt that happens all the time. But I think we all know a few people that were able to get some sort of, so it's not a total downside. Anyway, we were able to move in together, and I suggested to Tom we move in, and he wasn't. I think at first he was sort of like, didn't want to give up your, nice home, but we ended up building a home together.
And was that the home that you owned, Tom, or were you renting at that time?
I was renting.
You were.
I can't believe how many years ago it is, but I probably sold my home in Virginia in 2004, maybe something like that. So it's been a long time. Yeah.
And just talking about that sort of financial transaction for a minute, if you will, were you profitable on your home? Was it a good investment for you?
So it's really difficult to know how to answer that question in retrospect, because of course at the time I was like, oh, I made this really brilliant real estate decision. I purchased a home and it went up, and we made, I don't know, $50,000 when I sold it just a few years later. And I'm like patting myself on the back, like, wow, that was kind of brilliant. But I've never actually thought beyond that. It wasn't until I met Vicki when she started asking, okay, well, how much money did you spend on getting your roof fixed? And how much money did you spend on having your hot water fixed and heater fixed? And how much went into the ordinary upkeep of your house? Like, it never even occurred to me to think about that stuff. And I was like, I have no idea. So,
I'm such a jerk.
Yeah. So,
no, but that's reality though.
But did you, again, if you had $50,000 that just arrived in your bank account, you'd know it, right? You'd be like, oh, great, that's this with it. It just probably didn't, it's the math that showed you that money. So,
yeah. So I wasn't even thinking about these things. I tried, I knew that I was only going to own the home for a set number of years. And I wanted to try to find something that was super attractive in a really great location for a really good price. And I was like, oh yeah, that's it. If I just put those pieces into place, someone's going to buy it for more money than I paid for it. And I got lucky. It just so happened that just like the year before, it was like Rolling Stone or something like that had voted Charlottesville, Virginia, the #1 best place, small city to live in the United States. And then I was like, oh, I'm so sad. How smart am I? I picked the best city. Like, it definitely is not, in my estimation, the great place to live. But okay, fair enough. People love it there. I was super lucky.
You profited from the Rolling Stone article.
For sure. I think. And
to touch on what you said, Vicki, which I think is the crux of the buying versus renting debate in general. When we talk to clients about buying versus renting, there's usually a comparison as to what is the cost to rent versus what is the cost to have a mortgage. And those are the things that people often will compare and contrast when they're deciding, should I own or should I rent? And then there's the always what is said is, renting is like wasting money and flushing it down a toilet, whereas as long as you're, paying into your own mortgage, you're building up your own equity. I have heard this so many times, but I think what is also forgotten, to your point as well, is that there is an ongoing cost that is unknown to own a home. We don't know what maintenance is going to be required of the home. We'll often say a home is a money pit because it is. It is the first place that our money is sunk into when we have capital to go somewhere, because it's where we spend all of our time and it's what we want to, make part of our lifestyle. So I'm curious, because Tom, you've bought and rented. Have you noticed a financial difference in one versus the other? Do you find it less stressful financially to be a renter? Since you have that comparison, I'd be interested in your perspective on that.
So Andrea, it's really hard for me to answer that question for a lot of different reasons that I'm not so sure I want to go into, but I find it less stressful for sure. And having had that experience owning a home, and I keep talking about the roof, but the roof was like replacing the roof that the inspector didn't realize needed to be, or didn't really know, I guess hadn't done a good enough inspection. Like, I didn't realize how much it costs to replace a roof. So yeah, like I feel a lot less stressed about it, particularly taking a job as a professor, as like early in my career, I was making next to no money at all. So it's like, now I don't need to worry about things like paying for landscapers and a roof and all the rest of the things. So yeah, I thought it was absolutely early on in my career the least stressful choice for me, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and what I hear in that is that you didn't have a lot of control over your expenses. And yet that seems to be one of the major reasons I hear all the time for owning. I want to lock down my housing costs. I'm going to get a fixed. It's not a fixed mortgage in Canada, but I want to know that my mortgage is always going to go down. I don't have this variation in sort of rents, but we have the most stable housing costs of anyone I know, because the rent is all we pay, our rent and our utilities. And it gets held or it goes up. Ours hasn't actually gone up. I hope my landlord's not listening to this, but he's held the rent for us. And that means we pay under like market rate. And actually, all throughout my 20 or so on years of renting, if you average it out, it's always below market rate because it can only be raised so much. And so this idea of like, paying market rate, and I know that rents have gone up a lot, and it affects some of our decision making, essentially, if we want to move or stay. So I don't want to minimize the rental costs now, but it's still a very easy way to control costs, even if they're high. We don't have any big expenses that we won't know about. And I just find that's more comforting. I find it interesting that people are like, but I got to buy so that I can control my costs. It doesn't feel that way. And if anything, when people talk about buying to make sure they're paying the max now, but then it'll always go down. And I heard someone say this to me when they were talking about convincing a friend to buy, that, but don't you realize that the mortgage is hard now, but it's always going to go down? I'm like, I don't know if you're paying attention to interest rates, but they were going way up at the time. And I think, again, a lot of people got caught because they were sort of really believed that the mortgage will always be at its highest when you buy, then it'll keep going down. And a lot of people got that big spike, affected them a great deal. So if anyone, like, we're pretty impervious to interest rates, so we don't get affected by it at all. So it feels like the stability kind of, for the most part, at least now, feels higher as a renter.
And I'm assuming that's as long as you stay in your current place and don't get a new rent, which then could be impacted by interest rates if you were to go rent somewhere else. And landlords can inflate the prices of new rentals, let's just say, rather than staying in existing ones.
Yeah, for whatever reason, if you're a landlord, you should probably put your place at market rates, even if you don't need it for running costs, etc. Like that's just how it probably, should work. But again, then you're kind of budgeted into our financial future that, our rents will go up, and we'll, working with you, we try to make sure we understand that. But I think it scares a lot of people to have that unknown. We talk about stability. We don't really know what rent prices are going to do. And so people are worried about having this huge variable expense, especially in retirement. But at the same time, it's like, it's not, it's not that unpredictable. Like, and, it's, if we ever wanted to control costs in retirement, we could buy something then. So it's not like buying's totally off the table. It just depends on what stage we're in. So yeah, it just feels like renting makes sense. We're able to pocket the difference. And then if we needed to buy at any point, it's not like we're sinking all of our money into rent. We're sinking less of our money into rent than a lot of homeowners are sinking into the unrecoverable expenses of owning. So,
yeah. And certainly there's a rule of thumb, anywhere from 0.5% to 1% annual home maintenance on the value of the property. So if you have $1 million home, budgeting a good $5,000 to $10,000 a year is something that everyone should consider, let's say, to ensure that they can support those unknown expenses that are lumpy and that are unpredictable and that come up. And certainly, knowing that, let's say in the rental market, the landlord can only inflate your rent by so much as a percentage of your rent, which is, let's say in Ontario, I know it's 2.5%. I'm not sure what it is in BC. That's significantly less of a cost than the annualized cost of even just general home maintenance without any, major pitfalls that you need to set aside an emergency fund for. So I think there is a lot of stability, assuming that, the landlord isn't going to sell the property out from under you, and of being a renter. But even in that case, I know that there's guidelines to protect renters from being evicted in those cases. So I want to talk about where you are at now in your rental journey. So you're renting together, and where are you?
So we are in a townhouse, which Tom always says he never thought he'd live in a townhouse. But you like communal living, and I don't know why you didn't think about a townhouse, because we really love our little community. We like to live near the mountains. That's probably one of the harder things about renting, is that it's very easy to rent in a city, and we've lived in cities all our lives, but now we kind of want a more mountain lifestyle. So we want to, then you're dealing with more rural residential areas that there's more single family homes. So we rented the top floor of a house in a sort of single family home neighborhood. And yeah, we ended up moving to a townhouse, which I like a lot more. The population or the group here is a little bit, well, they're younger, kind of mostly younger than us. There's lots of kids running around, but the garage doors are open and you're able to kind of borrow things from your neighbors. We got to meet people here much more quickly than we did in a residential, because that community had a lot of people who'd lived there for a really long time, and they like to tell us. And it was a different vibe.
They did like to tell us.
And so you're in a younger community, and is it mostly homeowners or is it mostly renters?
Well, we happen to know that it's mostly homeowners because somebody liked to tell us that. And so that's one of our welcome to the neighborhood stories, is that we were walking around our new townhouse complex, and a woman came out of her house to sort of see who we were. We were like, oh, we're the new, we just moved here. And she goes, oh, that's a rental unit. And it's kind of funny, because then she started to go, well, we don't have a lot of rental units here. We don't really like to have renters, because, renters. And then she started talking to us like we were homeowners, like, as in, like, don't you hate those renters? They don't take care of the place. She's like, they don't take care of the place as much. And, this thing. And I couldn't help but laugh, because I feel like the kind of renting commentary is almost so ingrained that, she forgot that she was talking to a renter. Like, we literally just said, hey, we're renting. And then she's like, aren't they bad? So we didn't say much. She was a bit older, but I always laugh about that conversation. And I'm like, wow, I mean, we actually got to be part of that conversation about what people actually think about renters, even though we were, in plain sight. Mm-hmm. But I think about it a lot. I laugh about it, but it does sort of make me feel a little bit angry, because I just think, why do we get this label of not caring about our homes when we're renting? Like, in fact, we had to actually go through a huge scrutiny process like our finances scrutinized. We had multiple interviews actually, to get this place, because people want to have like a really great renter that's going to be responsible and take care of the place. And sort of like we actually got vetted more than any homeowner does. So, and I think one of the hardest things is I mentioned this story to some of people I knew who were homeowners, and rather than being like, oh, that's awful, they feel like, yeah, well, renters, what they could be like. Because again, like, there are people, of course, that are not taking care of places, and they're in the category of renters. But to lump everybody into that category is the part that I think gets the stigma around it. And like, but that we're renters, and we're not like that. Well, you're not like that, but other renters are. So I find that to be a very interesting stigma that we don't get a lot of exposure to what people actually think. But it definitely bugs me.
Is that something that you've just come across recently, or have you encountered that being a renter in the past?
I've never encountered that before. I mean, previously when I was talking about how everyone assumed what we would buy, now that we have the financial means and some stability to do it, we said no. They give us kind of sort of a snob look, but that, I mean, that's about it. I never really thought about people considering renters to be like less responsible. Like I said, we have to, when people buy a lot of homes in this area, they actually need renters to be able to help them pay for their mortgage. And so it's like, yeah, don't you need us in the community to be here? So why are you kind of turning up your nose at us as well? Like, you should be, a little more grateful, I think. So, and I think this is the crux of it, is because when you're younger, as I mentioned in the beginning of my journey, you have no choice. You rent. I was a student and I rented a house, and probably were a little noisier. But, being an adult renter, it's a different scenario. We're adults and we're responsible and we love our homes and we're building a community, as we talked about. But, we still get tagged with this like kind of student-y lifestyle. I think there was even a politician recently that talked about how renting is a kind of fun time of your life, but, let's get serious. And I have had people say like, when I got kicked out of my apartment in San Francisco and I was kind of complaining about it to my work colleagues, everyone said, oh, well, I guess you'll buy something now. And I said, what, why would I buy? And someone said, it's called being an adult. And I just thought like, yeah, this is a real thing. So It's not changed. And so I find it to be, it's not easy to be counterculture when you get that kind of feedback. And it does make you question. You're like, maybe I'm not an adult, but yeah, I kind of wish there was a little bit more, understanding that renting can actually be an intentional choice and not necessarily a default position because you've not been able to afford it or making bad choices.
Absolutely. And I think, to be said, which we talked about before we started recording today, it's not always a choice for everyone to decide whether they're going to rent or whether they're going to buy, especially given the cost of property ownership here in Canada and in major urban centers. It's not accessible to everyone. And I think we need to destigmatize that renting is the demon that it has been painted to be, or shamed, or shaming people into feeling like that's not a good financial decision to be making, when I think, in fact, it can liberate individuals from that pressure that they're feeling, usually from the generations gone by. Something that I've seen a lot in my practice is that the prior generation who had the fortune of purchasing properties at a much lower price point is imposing a lot of their own personal biases onto the next generation to say, look how successful I was. Don't you want to do the same thing? And they're well-meaning, absolutely, but it's not the same financial reality, and it creates undue pressure on individuals to become homeowners instead of to explore the possibility of just maintaining their status as renters. So I would love to hear a little bit from both of you on maybe either rent shame and what you've experienced from that perspective from either your community or your circle of colleagues or individuals that you know, and what you want people to know about adult renters to take away that stigma that exists.
even like adult renters, it feels like sort of true. Renters automatically, you just sort of think of like younger people. So, I mean, right away, I would love for that phrase to be a bit more common. We talked about like renting by choice or wealthy renter or things that fall. I mean, from my perspective, I feel like home ownership versus renting, it's just a lifestyle choice. And I come across as I don't think home ownership's for anyone. It's for many people. And like being evicted is no joke, or not having home stability. There are people in the community who have children who go to school here and they want to keep them in the same school. So I just want to say, like, I absolutely think home ownership is the right choice. But from a financial perspective, it's not the only choice, and it's not often the best choice. And I hope that, especially when I talk to people who are a little bit younger, who are trying to buy a home and feel like they're never going to be able to buy a home in Canada. And I feel for them because they sort of see that they can't do it. But I'm hoping to sort of explain, like, it doesn't have to be something that you do. It doesn't have to be the only way to have stability or to have, even wealth. Now, having said that, again, we're in a housing crisis where rents have gone up and the cost of living has gone up too. So I do feel a little bit like I might be like those homeowners or like older generations that bought their homes and the prices went up, so you should do what I would do. I don't want to come across and say you should do what I did, because when we were investing, the stock market did a really nice bull run. And so, again, I'm trying to be very clear on the information I want to share, because it is very personal. It's our experience. It's in the past. But it just doesn't have to be I'm hoping, again, we're still planning for the future, and renting is still in our plans because of what we know. And I'm trying to share a little bit about what I know from that perspective. Tom, anything that you want to add to that?
I mean, I was going to speak to this kind of shaming part. I don't know that I've ever really experienced. I mean, what happened here in the complex was very strange. Having like been invited into this complex and then into this conversation with the person who was just like, and we try to keep the renters down. We don't want to have too many of them around. It was very strange. So I've never really experienced that before, but I've very much been on the other side of that growing up. So my family was really into real estate. I was telling Vicki, my grandparents owned this now we would call it like low income housing or something, but they had this very large property, and I don't know how many units, how many apartments were on this property. Many. And I grew up in this kind of environment where this was like the people who lived there, like it was never spoken, but there was always this sort of unspoken thing that these are people who just hadn't really been particularly successful. We have to make sure that we're like doing inspections and doing like really important background checks, because you never know what you're going to get with renters. And it was, again, nothing was spoken, but there was this sort of sense that there was this background judgment that people hadn't been particularly successful. If they had been successful, they obviously wouldn't be living in our units in this really nice town. They would be owning a home someplace. And so I never really thought about it until we started talking about it. I'm like, oh, I can remember my grandparents talking about the renters. And so, like I said, I haven't, other than the conversation we had here, I don't know if I've ever really experienced it directly myself.
No, it's fair. I think the conversation is going to change, though, because whether people want to know or not, we're going to have more renters now because people who are locked out. And so you're going to end up with the, mature, responsible people who are also renting. And so that narrative is just naturally going to shift because of fewer people being able to own homes. And so maybe we can champion that sort of group as well. So absolutely.
From my perspective, something that I'll also share is that there is a cultural element to home ownership and owning real property. Depending on where you come from, different cultures, different areas of the world really value hard assets over, something like owning stocks or owning other types of asset classes. So I think that is definitely an element that comes into thinking about owning homes, because that is culturally embedded for a lot of individuals. That being said, it doesn't change the Canadian landscape in terms of the affordability of entering, and it just creates more pressure, I think, to make that happen. And something that I see a lot of as well is the adult generation, or sorry, not the adult generation, the prior generation helping to fund the younger generation's home ownership goals, because they want them to get in so badly. So there is often a lot of mutual wealth sharing that we're seeing in order to make that goal a reality, which is not available or accessible for everyone, to be said. So I think that intergenerational wealth transfer and sharing definitely comes into it for a lot of individuals. So what I want people to hear as well is, if you're feeling like you can't afford to own a home or can't do it, most people these days can't do it on their own and have help and do have support to help, especially make that first entry into home ownership at younger ages. So I just wanted to insert that element into the conversation. Is there anything else? Sorry, you wanted to say something to that, Vicki?
Yeah, I that is obviously something that I think about a lot. And there's this sort of, great wealth transfer from wealthy people to other wealthy people in the form of real estate. And it just feels like, but it's your home as well. I know you must have a lot of clients, or certainly when we were doing things with lawyers, like our wills and that sort of thing, we heard about stories about people trying to pass down homes. And it's sort of like the parents or whoever's trying to gift the home to the child, like, is not happy that child might not actually want to live there and stay there. And so, and my parents, they have some real estate, but they can't even imagine the thought of selling them ever. And I'm just like, but what's the point of your, it's tied up in a home. You can't live in multiple homes. And again, when you share it, it's a place to live. So this conflation of like the place where you live, your home, and the thing that is where most of your wealth is, it's the tricky part. It's the tricky part, because both get played at the same time, and that can make for really difficult decisions. So I have to say, like, I feel it is very freeing to know that sort of our wealth is not just like tied up in an asset. It's we don't have children, so we don't have to worry about like the passing of the family home. But I definitely know there's a lot of wealth transfers that are happening in the form of real estate, which can have emotional ties to it or emotional kind of requirements. And I'm just, it's just so not straightforward in terms of just money being transferred.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I want to ask your perspective specifically on the emotional part as a renter, because you're right, there is a lot of emotional attachment to owning a home. This is where we build our lives with our families, with our loved ones. We have so many memories that we don't want to let go of. And in fact, that attachment to a physical asset is what also leads people to ensuring that they want to keep that property in the home, because they're not willing to see someone else develop new emotional attachments maybe in that space. So as a renter, and maybe as if you've lived in your current townhome for an extended period of time, do you develop an emotional attachment still? I'm assuming there is some sort of emotional tie to your home still, but perhaps just in a different way. So would you be able to share anything from your perspective on that?
Yeah, we love our home.
Yeah.
We've been traveling for 8 months, so we just got back to it. And we literally just sort of sat around for a week just thinking, oh my God, I'm so happy we're back in our home. So you can get an emotional attachment to it. But if we didn't get to live in this home anymore, we wanted to move, then we kind of make our home somewhere else, right? And again, but I just think it's interesting that, you sort of started that question by talking about the emotional attachment and having a home, which I think it's actually can be more important than the financial aspects of it. But, it feels like the conversations we're having with previous generations is around this, again, you talk about the wealth part, then you talk about the emotion part. And it's sort of like, don't you want a home that you love and you cherish and you can change and your children grow up? Sure. It's like, but also, why do we talk about it as like, why are people then going on and talking about how much their house is worth all the time? It's like,
That's true.
you can't, I can't get over how often people can love to talk about how much their home's worth and how much they bought it for. And hey, you're talking about your home. It's not supposed to be your emotional attachment and where you raise your kids. So why does it matter what it costs? I don't know. I find that to be so interesting. Like, we would never talk about the size of our portfolio in public. It's not, even to our friends, it's churlish, right? But just like, there's no such regard for home ownership because people want to, they feel very proud that they, a lot, and they should be, they made a great decision, but didn't they make it for emotional reasons? I don't know.
Something that I'll never forget, my stepfather shared this with me before I bought my first property. He said, buying your home, not a rental property, is first a lifestyle decision and second an investment decision. So really prioritizing the emotional over the financial. And he said it has to be thought of first as a lifestyle, because investment-wise, it might not end up being a great deal. And you can't rely on that. You can't rely on the property to first satisfy your financial needs or your investment needs. If it is, in fact, the primary residence of where you live, that has to be first your lifestyle decision over anything. And lifestyle can mean so many different things to different individuals. For example, your lifestyle is, I want to be near the mountains. I want to enjoy a nice outdoor-centric lifestyle. And my property allows me the ability to be close to that. That's a lifestyle choice. And I think what I see a lot of happening is I just need to get into the market, the market being the real estate market. And sure, I have areas that I would like to be, but I can't be there because it's not affordable or for many other reasons, perhaps. And so I got to buy here because that's where it's cheaper. And that's not a lifestyle decision. More so, that's an investment decision. So I do see it happening the other way, just to be able to, quote unquote, enter the market or get in before they feel like they can't get in at all, which is a sad state of affairs in this real estate landscape.
Yeah. And getting in is sort of like, there's no other option. It's like, I have to get in sometime. And if I don't get in now, I'll never get in. And then what does life look like? And I don't even think that they'll necessarily think about that. So I've had sort of financial anxieties and insecurities. I actually was worried that the narrative is so strong. I was worried that I might, what does my financial future look like if I never own a home? Am I at a financial loss? Like, do I have less money in my bank account now? Is my net worth lower because I didn't buy a house previously? And even with this massive boom in real estate, especially in Vancouver, I don't think so. Again, it's lucky I didn't sit and go, oh, I'm going to be so good. Like, again, there was times where I just couldn't afford to buy a house. So I couldn't have bought it anyway. So I'm not going to sit here and sound like I'm some financial genius for choosing renting. It was a lifestyle choice for us. I just want to make sure that people don't feel like being locked out is going to result in financial ruin.
And in fact, when we started working together and we started working through the realities of your own long-term planning, I remember you saying it was a bit liberating to hear that being a renter wasn't a negative thing from a financial perspective, and that it was easier to plan in a way for rental stability and even taking into account, let's say, moderate price increases on rental. And I want to hear from your experience having that sort of instability, let's just say, that most people would view as instability, has helped in your own financial journey once we've gone through that planning process. Like, how has that process helped to give you more comfort or more, solidification of your own financial path?
Yeah, I mean, again, that confirmation from a financial expert planner was huge, because certainly you're not going to get it from the media. You're not going to get it from your friends. Like, we don't have anyone to talk to about whether renting for as long as we have and into the future, what that does look like from a financial plan. We literally had to go to a professional, and I still wasn't totally convinced that you would necessarily be able to tell us, not because you couldn't, but because there's not a lot of examples. So it's tricky to be counterculture and then try to defend yourself from a financial perspective when yeah, it's just like we don't have a lot of examples of people who've done this that I'm aware of. It's part of the reason we wanted to come on the podcast and talk about it, because and you don't get a lot of airtime to talk about it, what would be considered an alternative lifestyle. But I think the most freeing thing, besides knowing that our net worth was good, and again, we sort of invested in, low cost, index funds, ETFs. We're very sort of conservative, just steady investors, buy and hold. But to have it all as kind of liquid capital, you and we all started talking about what's it going to look like to start to spend that money. And it's very easy to spend. And so, I'm on a sabbatical now. I haven't worked for a while. And a lot of that was this kind of understanding of our financial position, but the fact that everything's a little bit liquid that I can pull from without making a massive and expensive, investment change. So, and that honestly makes me feel like I kind of never want to own a home, because I don't want to tie up all of my capital. Or do I want to take on a massive debt, which is very, very tricky. I don't know how easy it would have been to take a break if we had a big mortgage to pay. So again, I feel a lot of this is not necessarily intentional. A lot of it does feel incidental, which I'm grateful that it's worked out, but kind of seeing it and having it confirmed about, your wealth is actually very easy to access. I think a lot of people don't often think about how to access the wealth, especially if it's in their primary home.
Yeah. And there's a funny saying that I heard a long time ago is you can't sell your kitchen. So, how do you free up the equity that's trapped in the bricks if your home is what you're investing in and that you're, paying down your mortgage aggressively? And how do you then access that from a liquidity standpoint later on down the road? Sure, certainly people need to talk about.
Banks will lend it to you at 7-8%. We don't have to pay 8% to access our capital. That's the part that I find
so crazy.
I know. Yeah. They're just like, how it's your equity. It's yours. You own it. Why would you have to pay to use it? Right? That's to me, HELOCs are one of the biggest scams on the planet. But interestingly, if you put your money into your home and you need that money, the banks are like, yeah, I'll give it to you, but it's fine. I don't get it.
Yeah. Well, people would traditionally downsize, at retirement, let's say, and free up equity from their home and utilize the lovely principal residence exemption that we have here in Canada. But what I've actually seen is that people either aren't downsizing, or if they are, they're not really getting a lot out of it because the costs have gone up. And they're not really getting the same value from a lower cost home that maybe they would have before. And what I mean by that is lower cost homes have gone up so much.
Yeah.
And maybe not at equal proportion to higher cost homes, which are harder to sell because there's a smaller pool of buyers. So, I know that I had a client years ago and that was her entire game plan. She was a doctor and she had a large home, and her game plan was always to free up about $1 million of equity from her home sale. And when she downsized, she really didn't free up any equity. It was almost negligible compared to what she had planned on. So I think what the point of that story to say as well is, even in a home ownership situation, there isn't always certainty down the road because we don't know what's going to happen in life. There are so many factors outside of our control that we cannot possibly plan for all of them, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think being a renter or being a buyer in both scenarios comes with a certain level of uncertainty in different ways, and that we also have to understand that our paths will likely change, and that, maybe a decision that we made 5 years ago isn't the right decision 5 years later. One more stat from a mortgage broker that I am friends with is that the average mortgage term is broken in, I think, something like 33 months from the time that it is taken on. So a broken mortgage in the middle of a term for many different reasons. It doesn't mean that someone is selling the home, but it can be for health reasons. It can be for interest rate reasons, many different job loss, so many different elements that are uncontrollable in a financial situation that people are breaking mortgages for. So I think it's important to know that there's uncertainty on both sides.
And rental terms go longer than 33 months. That just is a a crazy stat. Yeah, I mean, people, life occurs. Like being able to buy a home and stay in the same house for 40 years is not that common, because of course, especially now when sort of people need to move. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's like, I think a lot of us have parents or grandparents who don't want to move out of their home. Remember, it's their home. We forget about them. We talked about the emotional attachment. Oh, by the way, you lived there for 40 years. Now your plan was to downsize. I don't think people want to do that. And I get it. Like, yeah, why would you want to then move to somewhere you've never been a home? So it's sort of like the financial plan, sounds great, but the emotional, pain of selling the home that you've lived in. But that just means a lot of people are living in houses that are not appropriate for them, or too big, or, have stairs. And I just think that's one of the downsides of creating a huge emotional attachment to your home. Again, not that I keep saying that this is like a bad thing, but again, it's the sort of mixing of the finances and the emotion. It makes things very, very difficult.
Well, it's just great to have that different perspective. I mean, that's all this is everyone has a different story. And what I would love to hear, to sort of summarize from both of you, is what is a takeaway that you want people to understand about renting, and something that maybe we haven't talked about yet that you want to make sure that our audience hears from you.
Oh my gosh, I feel like I could go on for too long here, so you might have to give me the signal that I too much. And I guess the first thing that it's one thing that's come to mind. The first thing is that a lot of times what happens is, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why I decided to move in the direction of rentals. One of the things that happens is that you have, like, you've saved, you have money, you're in a position to purchase. And then you go out and you look at what's available. And you look at it and you say to yourself, like, oh, well, we could get into this home. In the US, we call them starter homes. And like, we could really get into this starter home. And then you're like, yeah, we could actually really purchase something. But then when you think about the prospect of living in this space, you're like, oh, but the kitchen needs to be redone, the bathrooms need to get redone. And in order for it to be a space where, like, I would feel like it's my home. And I get all that. But sometimes what happens is, like, it costs so much money to just get into the market to purchase something that there's no way that you have enough money to make the changes that you want and also live where you want. And then all of a sudden renting becomes a lot more interesting, because then you're like, well, we could live pretty much anywhere we want, and it's ready to live in as soon as you get into it, because the kitchen's already done. Yeah. Like, the bathrooms have already been done to make them attractive to people who want to rent. And so then there's this kind of like, but my quality of life could actually really be improved, because I'm going to be able to live where I want to live in a space that actually feels like comfortable, and it's where I want to be. I've always wanted these marble countertops and gas stove. And like, I feel like there's you have a greater degree of freedom maybe when it comes to kind of, especially if you're not somebody like a friend of mine who makes millions of dollars a year, who can just be like, I can buy wherever I want and do anything I want to any home that I purchase. So there's that part of it. Sorry, I could keep going, and I'm going to keep going and going. But the other thing too is, like, it's more of a psychological thing. And like, this is an occupational hazard of mine. Like, in a way, I do cultural theory. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about some of these issues. But I think that we have this attachment to the idea that home is a physical thing. And in order to have a home, I need to buy this physical structure. And when I have that purchase made, then I can make a home in this physical space. But I think that one of the things that I've learned over the years is that the home is something that you make. It's not necessarily attached to a physical space. And like, a home is something you create with people and the community, whether that community is like a micro community of like 2 people, or a small group of people called a family, or an extended group of intentional individuals who decided to create this space, shared space together. Like, home is not, I'm not going to be locked out of getting a home if I don't buy a home.
Yeah.
And I think we have to kind of free ourselves from this thinking that like that is going to be the thing that delivers what I really want, which is an experience of home, a place where I can create memories and have these memories that last. But that's also then hard to do, because whether we like it or not, I think that, and I'm speaking a little bit more of United States kind of thinking, but like United States is a Christian country, and we've always sort of been told, even though we haven't been told this, that like wealth is a sign of God's blessing, and right, to have an outward display that you've kind of arrived is really important. And so not only does it give me like a home, because now I have the space where I can create that, but it also gives me a sense that I've arrived, I've come into something, I've been successful, and other people can now know that that's where I am. And so I'm going to kind of put the pause button right now, because I could go on and on about this kind of stuff.
I just have to, before Vicki, everything you said, it makes so much sense. I think just to summarize, a home is not a house, right? So differentiating between that, but also that cultural perspective of where you came from, as well as the stigma of, look what I've done, look how successful I am, which is really a reflection of self-worth and how you view your own personal successes and how you need to feed, let's say, the ego, as opposed to, in service of others, perhaps. So there's a lot tied into that question, and it's not necessarily a negative or a positive. It just is. But I think we don't give it enough thought, to your point. I think that there's a lot that goes into this decision of being a renter versus a buyer. And it is an expensive decision that we take for granted because it zeroes on a page. But it goes a lot further and a lot beyond that I think requires consideration for sure. Sorry, I just wanted to put my own thoughts in there. Vicki, I would love to hear from you. What have your thoughts?
I think Tom's thoughts are, as always, extremely well thought out, and mine sort of tumble out. But I feel like, yeah, this idea of the home being, where you make it sounds a little bit like, like cliche. Again, I know it's important to people, and sometimes home ownership is the way to achieve that. And so I think that that's important. I guess my only, I wouldn't feel so strongly about this if I didn't think that people have opinions and I didn't care what people thought, right? We use the term rent shaming. That's just in sort of relation to others. So I don't know why I feel so strongly about sort of making this point that, hey, we're not making a terrible decision, everybody. It is a societal thing. And sometimes I feel a little bit excluded from society and conversations, even in sort of neighborhood associations. When people are making a big strong point, they'll start off by saying how long they've owned and they live in the neighborhood. And that part of feels like, yeah, I guess my voice isn't as heard. And so, yeah, if I could say anything, again, I think the tide is turning a little bit. I don't think the way that the Canadian laws are set up are necessarily going to ever turn it completely. But I just think that it should be a little more open as options, that renting doesn't mean that you're not, a full-fledged member of society, an adult, someone who's financially successful, someone who has a say. I think that's the most important message I want to share.
I want you to share another message.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, because this is what really fascinates me about Vicki and the way that her mind works, is that when it comes time to thinking about how the upsides of renting, I think that what's going on so often, and I think maybe for the two of you, which I think is kind of really interesting, is that it turns out that renting can be a faster passage to early retirement. It can open up all kinds of possibilities for wealth generation that wouldn't say countercultural, but just aren't people's first thoughts. Because when it comes time, and I think that I don't really know this other than experientially, when it comes time to really understanding how to do things that are really complicated and scary, like investing, how do you do that? What is return? What is it? Oh my gosh, I can't believe that. What is compounding? How does this happen? but to realize that like one of the choices you might be making is like the best possible choice for your future, depending on where you are. Maybe like early retirement is like so important to you that this is a really good choice for you to make, to rent, and then you create time and space. Oh, sorry, this is what I mean about going on and on. So while I'm thinking about it, again, it has so much to do with like what you value. Like one of the things that's most important to me is maximizing the amount of time that I have to be with people, family, friends, Vicki, but also maximizing the possibility that if someone should get sick or I need to go do something and be with a member of my family, there's the time to do that. And one of the things like that's about like professional choices, but it's also about like home ownership sometimes, because if you've ever owned a home, you know that there are times where you're like, yeah, I can't do that because this weekend we've got to re-stucco the walls, or there's been water damage. So I don't want to say that's true of everyone. But okay, so now I put more pieces out there, but I would love to lead a conversation between the two of you about how renting can be like a passage to greater economic freedom. And
I think you're hitting on the sort of conversation of money and time, and there's no sort of greater way of exploring that when I'm thinking about, taking like career break or early retirement and literally exchanging money for time. But we do that every day as a renter because, we pay a landlord to fix our backyard or anything like that. We never go to Home Depot. And so we get a lot of time back and we pay for it. We pay, I think, less than owning a home, but it's that exchange of money for time. And I think that doesn't get mentioned very much as a pro in the renting column. We have a lot more time to do the things we like. We never spend weekends mowing lawns or fixing anything. And I know people kind of toss it out there, but again, time has real monetary value. So getting that for rent, to me, it's never ever been a question of throwing money away. That's money well spent.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, absolutely. And I think people who have never considered that should consider it. We're always looking to find more time in our very busy lives that we have created for ourselves. And there's never enough hours in the day. And homeownership does add another layer of complexity to demands on our time, for certain. And going back to what you said, Tom, about, talking about the freedom that creates for an early retirement, I have had other clients as well who have been renters and who are choosing the FIRE or financial independence retire early path because they have acquired more liquid capital assets that they can then generate a passive income from earlier than potentially they could have otherwise. And it doesn't mean that that's not achievable with home ownership, but there are certainly less immediate sunk costs if you're renting versus if you're owning a home. So it can absolutely lead to a lot more freedom in decision making if we can release ourselves from the stigma that we have to follow the path that has been laid out in front of us by, prior generations or by society or whatever it might be. Kind of building your own life plan, try as much as possible to envision what it is that you want for yourself first. Like, what is truly your values, not your goals, but what are your values in life, and how do you achieve those values, and how will financial flexibility help to do that if that's important to you? And then you can sort of reverse engineer your financial planning to suit your values. And that's, I think, something that isn't often discussed or thought of. It's just, this is the path that has been laid out and I need to achieve this path. But is that your path, or is that just what you've been taught that you should do?
And and is that what everybody else is doing? Like I say, it's very difficult to have conversations about, choices that are big and meaningful when every single person you talk to is on the other side. Not sort of because it's a side issue, but that just happens to be the way it is. Mm-hmm. And so it feels like hopefully now in this kind of, new way the world is, high cost of living, forcing various choices, we'll be able to, and of course, the more open conversations that are able to happen via social media, people can start to find their communities and talk to people who are considering things that might make more sense for them, or maybe they're sort of not able to make a choice the other way. And I think that's going to be key to realizing, hey, I'm not alone, and actually this is a good idea and this does work for me. And, that I think is really important.
Are you aware of any communities or resources, you mentioned social media, that people who are considering renting versus buying, or even just being a lifelong renter can access? Is there anything that you've come across that's been helpful? Nothing?
Even Reddit is just like where there's lots of communities, but I tell you, Personal Finance Canada is just absolutely full of just homeowners who bring up renting, and it's hard to find renters making comments because they get downvoted so hard, they get buried. So I rarely get to hear the conversation. That is another issue as well. So it's a very, like I say, there's lots of groups with women who are child-free, or couples who are child-free, or not getting married, and even not dating anymore. But I tell you, there's not a lot of open conversations about choosing to rent. It's the last stronghold, I guess.
All right, challenge accepted. Who out there is going to create the next Reddit subforum on renting in Canada? I challenge anyone listening to do that, because if it doesn't exist, Vicki and Tom, or anyone else listening, please start that, because it's an important conversation and deserves representation, which is, I think, the takeaway message from this entire conversation today is renting deserves representation. It is not just for children in university. It is for many, many people out there for many different reasons and decisions. And I appreciate both of your perspectives and bringing light to this conversation. So with that, any last words that you want to make sure that our audience hears today?
No, this has been great. Maybe you're starting the conversation right here.
Oh, thank you. And I'd love to have you on again to talk about some other issues that we did not get a chance to touch upon today. But thank you so much for your time. And thank you, everyone, for listening.